Is the Norse Loki the same as the Celtic Lugh? This is a question I get often, and if you do a quick Google search, you will find many people claiming on various blog posts and websites that Loki and Lugh are in fact one and the same deity, or at least very closely connected. Now, I really don't know where this idea comes from, but I'll take a few stabs. One is that people have done a poor job at trying to trace the etymology of Loki and likewise the etymology of Lugh, but it seems fairly well established that Lugh either means oath, or if it comes from light in some manner, that it's a particular kind of light, like a light flash or a radiance. Now, sometimes people think that his name is linked to the lynx, and this is actually a support for thinking that his name in some way does relate to light in a very ancient capacity, and in a capacity of radiance, because the name for lynx, at least in Greek, does come from Luke, for light. So it seems that there is a possible connection there. Nevertheless, whatever we want to believe that his name means, it's very clear from the text that he is associated with bringing light and the sun in some particular fashion. But this should be seen as a celestial controller figure, not as probably the physical sun itself. He is also very strongly connected with fire. Now, this is another element that people will want to pick up and say that he is perhaps associated with Loki, because of the false etymology that people have ascribed to Loki as meaning fire. This is not correct. It's rejected by almost all modern scholars, I believe. I'm not a Norse specialist, but it seems that the name is actually associated with knots. And finally, people probably pick up on this idea, which I don't even think is correct, that Lugh is this trickster deity, and Loki is this trickster deity, therefore they are the same. Now, there are some ways in which Lugh could be construed as a trickster, but this is generally ascribed to his ability, his great amassing of skill and knowledge, which allows him to outwit the enemy. But it doesn't mean that he is a chaotic deity at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And in many ways, he is a trickster because of his power to see into the future and to create future outcomes. And this is, I would say, much more similar to Odin. And I think that we can look just at the surface of things and think that Lugh is in fact very close to Odin, at least in several visible respects. One of those, of course, is he is the master of the spear. Secondly, he is the decider of the outcome of battle. Now, what this involves is that he can control the outcomes, and this is why Lugh is also a master of games, right? Because he is the decider of the victor of the game. And that requires a certain power over the future if you're going to be deciding things that have yet to happen. In this way, we see Mercury also in Gaul strongly associated with the eyes. So you have a god called Solitumaros, where it means the all-seeing, the great seer. And his eyes, in depictions of him, his eyes are wide open, looks like a madman, right? And in some sense, it's because he is a madman. Because Lugh is the god of the Feni. And the Feni, traditionally, are the seers, are the prophets. And in ancient Ireland, they had an equal status to the king. The position was known as the Ard Olav, or the Rí Olav. And I'll be dealing with that when we talk about early medieval Irish history. So Lugh is fundamentally a prophetic god, and in many ways associated with Apollo. And he is likewise identified in some cases with Apollo in Gaul and in Britain, but in many other cases associated with Mercury and sometimes even with Mars. But on a mythical level, the preserved myths that we have about Lugh do not focus on any aspect of trickery. They focus, in fact, on the opposite, that, well, in some sense he uses his intelligence and tricks Balor into a final confrontation that he has already decided the outcome of. And in the battle, he brags to Indech, the king of the Fomorians, that it must be sad to watch the battle unfold, knowing that it is Lugh who decides upon who to crown in the battle. But the other tricky aspect to Lugh, and I say tricky with kind of quotation marks around it because it isn't what we would consider to be tricky, but it's that his powers are fundamentally magical. And that means his powers go beyond the normal, and it means that they violate in some way the warrior ethic. We see the warrior ethic as exemplified by Nuada in the first battle of Maitudha. Now, in that battle, he arranges his troops on an equal footing with the Firbolg, such that they have the same number of men, the same armaments, everything equal. And the battle concludes once that equality is broken, when Nuada is challenged to single combat, but the terms cannot be equal because he only has one arm, and his opponent refuses to fight with one arm. Therefore, the combat breaks down. The battle ends. And various editions of the Lauragval Naherin state that Nuada and the others didn't want to bring Lugh to Ireland initially. He was intentionally abandoned or left behind. And they burned the ships partly to stop the Fomori, but partly also to prevent Lugh from following. And one of the versions tells us that the reason they don't want him to follow is because they want to win Ireland without trickery, without deception. But what is this trickery and deception of Lugh? It is this ability to control the outcomes, and that comes from his magical power. And we see this also associated with Cuchulainn and the Gai Bolga. The Gai Bolga is the decisive ender of all combat. It is the one-shot kill. And Cuchulainn is specifically called tricky for using this ability, because it goes beyond what any other warrior is able to do, and it ultimately makes him the winner, no matter what. Because anything it hits, it kills, and nothing can stop it. And so Ferdiad, right when he is dying from being hit by the Gai Bolga, calls Cuchulainn tricky for using this ability. And it's this kind of thing that Lugh also does to Balor. Balor is a great, strong warrior that nobody can overcome. Nuada and Macha fighting him are both cut down. But Lugh comes and he doesn't even engage with him. All right? He stands back and talks for a while with him, and then casts one shot at him and kills him. This is the same kind of thing, the same idea as the Gai Bolga, where you are hitting from a distance some unstoppable, unmissable blast of death that will ultimately decide the battle. And so Lugh is tricky specifically because of this ability, and because of his intelligence and so on, which allows him to decide outcomes, which allows him to, kill any opponent from a distance where he doesn't even engage with them. Just like Apollo is one-shotting people from miles away, right? This is the same sort of idea. Now, how does this correlate with Loki? It really doesn't. It doesn't in any way. It does have a lot of similarities with Odin, however. Further, Lugh goes on to become one of the three primary kings of the gods, a warrior that is engaged with the Fury. So this dramatic change of mental state that sees one become transformed into a vicious beast, right? As exemplified by Cuchulainn. And this all connects back to the idea of inspiration, of some sort of internal fire, of heat, of impelling. Now, often, right, we get the fun side of Lugh sort of predominantly exhibited on various websites and so on, where they'll talk about him as a god of crafts or something. This is really sort of far from the mark in a sense. He's related to crafting in the sense that he is related to inspiration, in that he is related to bringing mental illumination, transformative mental states, dreams, visions, etc. But it would be a mistake to think of him as simply a craftsman god. The reason that he's likely tied to making shoes and other things is because of his extensive traveling, the nature of him always on the move. So he always needs shoes, but also he's tied to skill because of the things already mentioned. And so he is the driver and enlivener of all people, of all inspirational activities, of all creativity, because of this connection with the mental fire, which is then expressed in the physical world with the physical fire, the movement of the sun and the stars, etc. Now, Lugh was the first to create games like Fichel, is basically chess. He invents horse racing, horse riding. He is the first to ride a horse. And he is the one to invent horse combat as well. So there's this very, very close association with him and the horse, and he might well have been seen as a horse god in the past. Or at least to have had a horse form. And it's in this respect also that I've heard him linked to Loki, because Loki supposedly changes into a mare and gives birth to the horse which Odin rides. Now, Lugh is seen as a king, but also as an enforcer. And in some cases, he is said explicitly to be the enforcer of Nuada. Nuada being the king, and him being sort of the militant arm of the king. Or as George Dumezil put it, Nuada is like Mitra, sort of the god who's associated with justice and human law, and Varuna is sort of this dark enforcer. And I think there is this kind of dynamic at play. For another thing that we see Lugh associated with is the chain. Lugh's chain, it's called, and this seems to be another name for the Milky Way, which is also expressed as some sort of pillar of the sky. So he's not only chaining people, he is said to chain the prisoners of the Milesians, so humans, and the prisoners of the Tuatha, so the prisoners of the gods and the prisoners of humans. He binds them, he chains them and imprisons them. And just as he has the ability to inspire people and to give them energy and movement, he can take that away and make people unable to move or speak. And he can also do the same thing with plants. So he can enliven plants, bring trees to life, make them move. And an inscription to Mercury in Britain calls him the Great Enlivener. And this is an epithet for Savitar in the Rig Veda. And like Odin, Lugh also seems to have some kind of afterlife realm or otherworldly fortress. And it literally is called the Fortress of Lugh. And it would seem to have been thought of as a very exclusive type of place, where Cuchulainn says that he was invited there by Lugh and given great honor. So Lugh is fundamentally a god of establishing and maintaining order. And I think we can also say the same about Odin, even though some of his myths are very, let's say, Norse flavored. The underlying aspect is that he is establishing and maintaining cosmic order. And Ragnarok is where that order comes crashing down. And there, we also get a flavor of this in Celtic myth being suggested by the Morrigan, that the order that's established by Lugh in the second battle of Moytura will eventually be destroyed. But in the conclusion of that battle, Legalistic, who is sort of the communicator between the Fomorian forces and Lugh, says that it is Lugh who will decide in all sort of disputes in the future, so that he is deciding upon law and resolution. So while in popular fiction or what have you on people's blogs, they want to characterize Lugh as this trickster god, this is really not the fundamental characteristic of the deity at all. He is tricky in only the respects that I have mentioned, in that he is very intelligent, and that he decides outcomes in battle, and he uses magic. To the extent that these things are tricky, then he is tricky, but he is not a chaotic entity. In fact, he is the exact opposite of the chaotic entity. He is the one who establishes order. And he does so in a fairly unrelenting and ruthless way. He is called a great slayer of men. And in fact, in an untranslated section of the conversation between Fintan and the Hawk of Achil, the Hawk says that Lugh was the greatest warrior, one like he's never ever seen in any part of the world, and that he feasted very well during his reign because the fields were littered with bodies. And we see that he kills a number of other gods, and always in relation to a violation on their part. For instance, when his father is killed, he kills the gods, and even the gods who are said to be the gods of the Dodona, he kills them because they violated the law. And he will not accept any sort of recompense for this, which was the normal course. It was the normal practice was if someone was murdered, then you would accept a payment for that murder. He refuses this because only blood will equal for blood in his law, right? And this is also brings him into line with the Christian idea of law, which is later brought in, and why Lugh here is in this myth enacting in a way the Christian version of the law and reinforcing that, because they tried to do away with the idea that you could pay off for murder, right? This became unacceptable in the medieval period. And so they rework the original tale of Lugh, which originally is simply a vengeance tale. He didn't use legal means to bring about their deaths. It says in the Laur Gaval and the Heron that he kills them above the sea near the Isle of Man, right? Over the clear shining sea, he kills them. The later myth that we have is simply some version that's been reworked in order to have this sort of legalistic measure that because it was illegal to take vengeance on someone, right, to enact this sort of blood vengeance. So they reworked the original myth into the legalistic framework of the medieval period. But nevertheless, Lugh is associated with this kind of vengeance and revenge that is enacting in a legalistic way as punishment for some wrongdoing or transgression by another party. And so often in tales it's someone named Lugh who is the one to cast a spear to kill somebody. One, because Lugh has an unerring shot, right? Just like Apollo's arrows, he casts the arrow, he kills somebody. This is the same feature as Lugh's spear. It is a distance weapon. It is not. It is equivalent to the bow. It is not a spear that's used in hand-to-hand combat. It is in fact a javelin. And I can already hear someone saying, well, isn't that how Loki has Balder killed? Well, not really. The circumstances are quite different, and the reasons are quite different. With figures that are named Lugh or Luggage, it's almost always in relation to revenge. Even the killing of Cuchulainn has to be enacted by a figure called Lugh. This is done to avenge the murder of Curoi, which was an unjustified murder, by the way, by Cuchulainn, where Cuchulainn in fact uses the same trick against Curoi as is used against Say in Welsh myth. And this is when we understand the genealogy of Curoi. It in fact, he links directly back in the human genealogy to Lugh, whereas the genealogy of Cuchulainn, although his mythical genealogy might link him to Lugh, his physical genealogy links him to the Dagda. And so, although Lugh is associated with casting spears and killing from a distance, this really isn't the same as Loki. Loki isn't even the one to cast the spear. The obvious connection here is between Lugh and Odin, who I think are fundamentally connected. I don't know if they have the same origin or if it's just because they're associated with similar things, they develop very similar traits. But nevertheless, I think there is a very, very strong similarity between these two deities, and almost no similarity between Lugh and Loki. And in many ways, I think they're exact opposites. The misunderstanding with many people has simply come in from this folkish understanding of Lugh, which has no connection with the actual deity itself. It's just sort of something that's been created out of pop culture, essentially. Anyhow, I hope you found this interesting. I'd like to give a big thanks to my Patreon subscribers. If you'd like to help out the channel, please become a member. You can make video requests, and I'll be able to deal with your questions and so on. Gurv Mila Magat, Aseisteach Agus, Marigoni, Shas Gohard.